Hi everyone, this is Ayush. I'm a CM at Udacity for the iOS team, and today we're having a webcast talking about completion handlers and how they might be useful and effective and what the term bubbling up means. So completion handlers might be one of the trickiest concepts in learning how to program with Swift, but they're also one of the most important. Before we dive into them, let's clear up some terminology though. Completion handlers are a type of closure, and closures are essentially self-contained blocks of code, which can be either stored in a variable or just passed through parameters like we've been doing. So completion handlers are just a type of closure, and they're usually given that name because they're called whenever an event completes. So before we dive into all of this bubbling up and stuff, let's take a quick look at how we might write a completion handler. So here's the general overview. So we start with parameters, which are contained inside of parentheses. And then we have the little arrow, which is, we have the little arrow, and then we have the result type. So this could be an int, or this could be a type void. And then we have the keyword in. And so after that, we have the curly braces, and that's where the rest of our code goes. So one of the things we're going to do here is just look at a few brief closures, but bear in mind that we have a full course dedicated to this. So take a look at Gabrielle's Swift syntax course, and you'll find a lot more information about closures there. Um, so sorry, let me just open up the slideshow here. And we're gonna walk all the way to this part. So we're gonna go over this code here in just a moment, but this is what a closure could look like. And so one of the cool things you'd notice here is on the very first line, we're using something called a type alias. So when we're using these closures and again and again, what we can do is write the syntax for the closure at the very top. So we would do type alias and then like the variable name equals and then our entire closure. So we can just pass through completion handler now as a parameter, as you'll notice in the very next line, which says func get request token, and then in parentheses it contains completion handler. So I hope this makes sense. Again, you can find a lot more about closure syntax and how to write closures through Gabrielle's Swift syntax course. But now let's just take a quick look at how everything bubbles up. So we've talked about bubbling up a lot, and one of the examples we've used that in is through our networking course. In our networking course, one of the tasks that we're often required to do is get the request token to use a particular API. And so the way that function might work is we begin by asking, or begin by calling the function getRequestToken, which then calls a couple other functions, such as taskForGet and parseJSON. So this is how this would work. So we call getRequestToken, which then calls taskForGet, and then which then calls parseJSON. And in the end, what we do is, or what we get is the actual request token that we need. So one of the things that could happen is we might have an internet problem. Our server might time out, or our data task with requests might throw some errors. And what happens then is these errors will bubble up. So if we take a look back into our code right here, if we get an error, then we're essentially passing the error back up to the getRequestToken function. So the error gets passed up to the getRequestToken, which then informs the person that's actually calling the getRequestToken that, whoa, no, there was an error with the internet connection, and that can be really problematic. However, when we don't have an internet problem and we actually get data from the server, then we're calling parseJSON. And so with parseJSON, we can have more problems. So we can have problems such as the JSON format might be incorrect. And while the likelihood of these errors is very low, these can still be problems. And so what happens then is this error gets bubbled up to task forget, which then tells the get request token that there was an error, and it passes the same incorrect JSON format error all the way up the chain. So when everything works correctly, we essentially have we pass the result back from parse JSON all the way up to task forget, which then passes the result all the way up to get request token. So we've bubbled up the result, and that's how the bubbling up works in this case. So again, let's take a brief look at the code here. You'll notice that the arrow points to task forget. So that's the first function that's being called, and this goes back to our diagram that we're looking at. So if there was an error as a result of task forget, we print out the error. Otherwise, we'll print out the request token we get. So now let's first dive into task forget. So in the task forget, we call the data task with request. And in the data task with request, if there is an error, then it says completion handler, result is nil, and error is the error that we received as a result of our data task with request. So when we do this completion handler, result nil, error, error, it bubbles up to the get request token. And as a result, our get request token will print out error, error.localized description, so whatever the error might be. So otherwise, if we actually have data as a result of our data task with request, then we call the parse JSON function. And this will do a few other things. So if there's an error just parsing the JSON, so we call the very last line, which says completion handler, result is nil, and error is an JSON serialization error. So that error will then get bubbled all the way up to task forget, which then gets bubbled up all the way to get request token. Likewise, if the token field doesn't exist in our JSON file, then we have a parsing JSON fail error, which then gets bubbled up to task forget and all the way up to get request token. But when everything works and we have the right token field, then completion handler result request token and the error is nil. That way we can send the request token that we were looking for all the way up the chain. So that was just a short history or discussion of how we might use closure, or of how closures will bubble up. But one of the questions we often get is, why are closures useful? And to be completely honest, they're not all of that life-changing. Everything you can do with closures, you can do without closures. But one of the main reasons we use closures is because they help us make more readable and better code. And that's really important when you're working with large projects where closures are a lot of what you need. Another thing you'll notice is we use closures whenever we're doing things as a result of operations that we don't know how long they'll take. So, for example, when we're making a network request, we have no idea how long it's going to take the server to send us the data back. So in that case, we will use these closures to execute something as soon as the server sends a result back. Another area we might use these in is animations, where we want to animate an object over time. So we use a closure in that case, or a timer. Another area is Grand Central Dispatch, where we use a closure to kind of put things onto the main queue or the background queue. So that was just a quick history of closures, and I'd really like to open up the floor to answer any questions you guys might have at this point. So one of the questions we have from a student is, aren't exceptions used instead of passing an error? So it depends in this case. So here we're using, so if you look at the screen now, we're passing the error back up so we can print out what the error message is. We can throw an exception, but the problem there would be that the app could crash, or it wouldn't really tell the user any good information about what's happening, and that's just not good for the user experience. So really we want to pass as much information back as possible so we have something to do with the information, and then we can figure out how to handle like a particular error message. Um, cool. So, any other questions you guys might have? And Hike 484, I hope I answered your question properly. Please let me know if there's something else that you were looking for. So closures are, still often one of the most like complicated things, and really the point of this was to discuss closures. So for more practice on closures, you might want to try writing some of your own. One of the best like ways to do some of these things is to write a closure for like a function called minimum. So inside of this closure, take in two inputs, such as a, which represents the first value, and b, which represents the second value, and add a return type. So you could return an int, and inside of the closure, just return the value that is less. So if a is less than b, then do return a. Or if b is less than a, then return b. So you can really practice with a lot of these things. So min is a great example. Max is a great example. You can do something to find the sum. So Jeff here is asking, what is a complete signature for completion handler? So let's just take a look at, sorry, I believe the camera was hiding the actual declaration of completion handler. So if you look at the very top line, you'll see that there's a line that says type alias completion handler equals result, which is of type any object, and then an error, which is just an NS error. And then we have the return value of void, so we're not returning anything. So when you specify something with a type alias, that's just a really easy way of kind of having a shorthand notation. So that way we don't have to write the result, any object, error, NS error, returns void every single time. Are closures considered to be a type of control flow? That's a question from the Sushi Man. So closures, I do not believe are a type of control flow. Closures are similar to functions in a way that they're just blocks of code. But the awesome thing about closures is you can store those in variables. So they're not really any type of control flow, but uh, you can essentially execute code or chunks of code whenever you want to. So imagine them to be analogous to functions that you can kind of store in variables. So Hike 484 asks, yes, sometimes you want to wait for a result. What is the best way to wait for a result from a completion handler? So the entire like purpose of a completion handler is to pass a result back as a parameter whenever the completion handler is called. So whenever the event has finished executing. Um, so in that case, we're usually not using a return type, but instead passing the values that we need back through the parameters. So here we can see how we kind of do that. So in this case, whenever we get a result, so look at the last chunk of code which says parse JSON. In the parse JSON function, if let request token equals JSON token. So essentially, if the token field exists in the JSON file that we're looking at, then we pass the result back, and then we say that the error is actually nil. Right. So whenever our code goes all the way back to task forget, so this is the get request token. So whenever we bubble all the way up to the main parent function, we have a result back, so it prints out that result. So here we're waiting for the result, but we We aren't like explicitly declaring a return type, if that makes sense. Okay, Ryan asked a great question. How does a completion handler get associated to task forget? So one of the things that we often use and we don't explicitly mention is trailing closure type. So whenever a closure is the last parameter of a function declaration, then we can essentially replace that last parameter and then with nothing and kind of add the curly braces at the end of our function call. So you'll see that in a few places here. Um, so this is true in session.dataTask with request. So data task with request actually takes in two parameters. The first parameter is the NSURL request, and then the second parameter is the completion handler, which has the parameters data, response, and error. So because that second parameter is a closure, we can just delete that and then add the curly braces and kind of specify our closure afterwards. This is referred to as trailing syntax. And yes, Richard, closures are a pretty major part of asynchronous programming, and you'll be doing a lot of asynchronous programming throughout the iOS Nano degree and then also in the workplace. Um, so that's closures. Um, there's a lot more you can do with closures. Again, a lot of that is just practicing. So you might want to just go and think of a few examples. Min and max are pretty good examples. Then you might also want to think of or play around with functions such as filter and sort and map. So these are all closures that we use pretty heavily in iOS programming, and they're very useful for doing simple things such as sorting an array or filtering an array whenever we're implementing a search thing. So when we're searching for stuff, we can use a sort function to kind of filter an array based on our search conditions. So if we have an array of a whole bunch of recipes, then we can use the filter function to kind of filter all of the recipes that have a cookie name that matches blank. So Jeff asks a question, how would closures and Lambda functions differ? Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with Lambda functions. So I'm sorry, Jeff. I guess I don't have a great answer to your question. So hike 484. Okay, you rephrase your question. So the question is now, I have a case where I collect data with many REST calls, and after collecting all of the data, I want to process that result, i.e. I have to wait after all REST calls have completed. And yes, so again, this goes back to all of the bubbling up and things like that. So we don't have anything to process until all of the request calls have been completed. But at any stage, uh, for example, so our task forget could fail, or if we have a few other stages, any of those stages could fail. And in that case, this bubbling up allows us to pass the error up the chain. So we get either the result from any of the fields, or we either get the result after all of the functions have finished executing, or the error message at any stage inside of our function chain. And thank you, Eden. Just as something to finish up with, there are a lot of different closure syntaxes that you can take a look at. Eden's mentioned that in the chat. there's a great website, goshdarnclojuresyntax.com. Check it out. It's got great resources to just learn how to specify a whole bunch of different types of closures. And it also talks about the storing closures as variables that I was referring to as earlier. Wonderful. So if any of you have any other questions, feel free to find us on the forums or during one-on-one sessions. We'll be around then. Thank you for tuning in today. It was great talking to you all. I hope this helped. Let us know if there's anything else you'd like to hear from us with our live streams in the future. Thank you.